I'm Ryan.
And I'm Tessa.
This is The Dark Dive, where we examine the stories that refuse to stay buried.
Every episode, we follow the evidence, confront the unknown, and bring clarity to the shadows.
No speculation, no sensationalism, just the truth, wherever it leads.
You're listening to The Dark Dive. I want you to imagine a 54-year-old mother. She is standing in her laundry room, just methodically scrubbing her teenage son's clothing.
Just a completely domestic, everyday scene on the surface.
Exactly. And in the very next room, in her kitchen, she has an oven preheating to bake a pizza for her son and his friends.
Right.
It looks entirely ordinary, but it is masking a reality that is so gruesome it completely defies logic.
Because just a few miles away, out in the dark, two teenage girls are lying in an isolated barn.
Yes. Both of them are dead. They had been shot, stabbed, and brutally battered.
And Tessa, that horrific contrast between everyday domestic life and unspeakable violence is really what defines this entire case.
It is. Today we are examining the murders of 15-year-old Abbey Worrell and 14-year-old Jamie Kelly.
This happened in late September of 1994 in Pataskala, Ohio.
Right. And it is a story that requires you to abandon every assumption you have about safety, about the protective instincts of parents, and really about the people we allow into our inner circles.
If you grew up in a community like Pataskala in the mid-90s, you know the environment. It was the kind of town where teenagers sneaking out of their houses to attend a local party was, viewed as a standard rite of passage.
Right, just typical adolescent rebellion.
Exactly. There were no smartphones back then, no GPS tracking. When you left the house under the cover of darkness, you relied entirely on the physical safety of your surroundings, the people you were with.
But the reality of what occurred on the night of September 25th shattered that illusion of safety entirely.
It really did. And the terror of this case is not just contained in the brutal act of the murders themselves. It is the agonizing week that followed.
Yeah, for 7 full days, Abby and Jamie were missing.
I mean, you have to imagine the sheer panic of their families, right? The friends, the local law enforcement agencies mobilizing to find them.
They were searching everywhere, and they found absolutely nothing until October 2nd, 1994.
That is when a newspaper carrier happened to notice a fire burning in an isolated barn near Baltimore, Ohio.
Right, and when firefighters responded to that scene to extinguish the flames, they made the grim discovery.
2 bodies, severely charred, hidden deliberately inside the structure.
And to understand how a perfectly normal teenage night out ended in a burning barn a week later, we really have to look past the physical evidence first.
We have to look at who these girls were. And more importantly, we have to examine the individuals they trusted that night.
Because the most unsettling aspect of this entire ordeal is that Abby and Jamie were not abducted by strangers lurking in the shadows.
They were betrayed by familiar faces.
Let's establish the background here, starting with the victims. Abby Marie Worrell was 15. Jamie K. Kelly was 14.
Both were students at Watkins Memorial High School.
Right. They were close friends, just navigating the normal, everyday pressures of high school life. They were entirely unaware of the danger they were walking into.
And the critical piece of context we need to understand here is Abby's connection to the group they met that night.
Yes. Abby had previously dated a 15-year-old boy named Robert Sheets, who went by Bobby.
And Tessa, that is the baseline of familiarity that turned out to be fatal.
Absolutely.
When you are 15 years old, an ex-boyfriend might be someone you have complicated feelings about. He might be someone you argue with. But he's rarely someone you perceive as a lethal threat.
That trust is the exact mechanism that pulled Abby and Jamie into danger.
Right. When Abby arranged to meet Bobby after leaving that party, she was operating under the assumption that she was safe. She knew him. She had been in his house before.
But she did not know what Bobby was bringing with him, or the broader circle that had gathered at the Sheets household that night.
This was not a solitary, spontaneous act of violence by one unstable individual. This was an active group dynamic.
Let's look at the core group of offenders. First, we have Robert Louis Daniel, a 16-year-old who the court documents identify as the primary shooter.
Okay.
Then there is Sonia Hawkins, who was 19. She was either Daniel's current girlfriend or a recent ex-girlfriend at the time.
And the verified records show that Hawkins harbored an intense, open hatred toward Abby.
She did. And I want to pause on that dynamic for a second, Ryan. You have a 16-year-old boy and a 19-year-old woman who is carrying a deeply personal, toxic grudge against a 15-year-old girl.
Right. And then you add Bobby Sheets, the 15-year-old ex-boyfriend, who is the owner of the firearm that will eventually be used.
Yes. You mix that combination of jealousy, teenage posturing, and access to weapons, and it is a recipe for absolute disaster.
It is. But the cast of characters goes even deeper into a profound moral failure within the home itself.
This is where we have to introduce Elsie Sheets. She was 54 years old, and she was Bobby's mother.
The level of adult complicity she provided is just staggering. She became a primary figure in the concealment of these crimes.
We also have to acknowledge the peripheral figures who set the stage that night, like Jennifer Patrick. She is Elsie Sheets' niece, and she provided transportation for the group earlier.
And Zana Harrington, who lived at the Sheets residence and witnessed the chaotic environment of that home.
When you look at this group, a volatile 16-year-old, a 19-year-old driven by vicious jealousy, an apathetic 15-year-old ex-boyfriend, and a completely complicit 54-year-old mother, you realize this wasn't just a random clash.
No, their interactions late on the night of September 25th followed a step-by-step escalation into absolute violence.
Ryan, it is time. We're now entering the dark dive.
Let's trace the exact movements late on that Sunday night, September 25th. Abby and Jamie leave the party. Abby makes the arrangement to meet up with Bobby.
Bobby arrives, but he brings Robert Daniel and Sonia Hawkins with him.
Right, so this newly formed group, Abby, Jamie, Bobby, Daniel, and Hawkins, returns to the Sheets residence.
And up until this specific moment, if you put yourself in Abby and Jamie's shoes, this is likely just a late-night gathering. They're hanging out with people they know.
But then the environment shifts. The group decides to walk from the Sheets property to a nearby graveyard.
And the official records isolate this specific location, this exact moment, as the turning point.
They are standing in the graveyard, and 16-year-old Robert Louis Daniel turns to 15-year-old Bobby Sheets and says, "Let's kill them."
He is referring directly, unequivocally, to Abby and Jamie.
I keep looking at the psychology of this moment, Tessa. How does a casual teenage gathering instantly pivot to a spoken plan for premeditated murder?
It is hard to wrap your mind around.
And more importantly, why is there a complete lack of intervention from the others when Daniel actually says it out loud?
It is a chilling psychological threshold. When Daniel says, "let's kill them," he is essentially testing the boundaries of the group's morality. In chaotic, unstructured teenage dynamics, especially when you introduce individuals who are posturing for status, an extreme statement like that can sometimes act as a bizarre form of testing the waters.
Like he's throwing it out there to see who flinches.
Exactly. But here is the critical failure. When no one pushes back, when Bobby doesn't immediately say no, when Sonia doesn't stop him, that silence acts as authorization.
The silence becomes permission.
Yes. By not rejecting the idea the very second it is spoken, the group collectively crosses a line. The lack of objection normalizes the intent.
So the violence suddenly becomes a shared objective rather than an isolated, unthinkable thought in one person's head.
And the speed at which that shared objective moves from thought to action is terrifying. Following that moment in the graveyard, the group walks back to the Sheets' property.
Which is where the executions occur.
The sequence detailed in the case files is brutal. Once they are back at the property, Robert Daniel seizes the firearm.
And we have to remember this firearm belonged to Bobby Sheets. It was concealed, but Daniel takes it.
He turns the weapon on the two girls. 14-year-old Jamie Kelly is shot in the head.
And the forensic findings confirm she is killed instantly.
Daniel then turns the gun on 15-year-old Abbey Worrell. He shoots her 4 times, 3 times in the chest, and once in the head.
It is just horrific.
It is. But despite sustaining 4 gunshot wounds, Abby incredibly survives this initial barrage of gunfire.
I struggle to comprehend the pure horror Abby must have experienced in that moment. She is bleeding from 4 gunshot wounds. Her best friend has just been killed in front of her, and she is surrounded by people she knows.
It is a nightmare.
But Tessa, before we discuss the escalation, I need to focus on Bobby Sheets. Bobby is standing right there. This is his property. It is his gun.
Right.
Abby is his ex-girlfriend. He possesses every conceivable connection to the elements of this crime, and yet he falls into a state of complete paralysis. He does absolutely nothing to intervene.
That inaction is a defining factor in how the law eventually views him. Bobby's failure to act isn't just a physical freezing due to sudden fear. It is a profound moral abdication.
Yes.
You have to consider his role in the setup. He provided the weapon, he provided the location, he provided the false sense of security that brought Abby to that property in the first place.
His inaction was as lethal to those girls as the bullets fired by Daniel.
Exactly. And the nightmare does not end at the Sheets property. Let's detail the escalation and the relocation.
Abby is shot 4 times, including once in the head, but she is still breathing. The group realizes she is not dead.
So instead of calling for help, they place her into the trunk of Bobby's car.
They then drive from Pataskala to a deserted barn near Baltimore, Ohio.
Think about the agonizing reality of that transport for a second. A 15-year-old girl suffering from catastrophic injuries, trapped in the darkness of a moving trunk.
While her ex-boyfriend and his friends drive her to a secondary location.
It demonstrates a level of deliberation that completely removes any argument for an accidental or purely spontaneous tragedy. They are consciously moving the problem to hide it.
When they arrive at the barn in Baltimore, the violence continues.
Daniel and Hawkins both participate in stabbing Abby.
She has already been shot 4 times.
Right. And now she is subjected to severe incised wounds from a blade. But even that is not the end.
The final, fatal act is almost medieval in its brutality.
Robert Daniel leaves the immediate area inside the barn, locates a concrete block, returns, and drops it directly onto Abby's head.
That catastrophic blunt force trauma is what finally ends her life.
The sheer physical effort required to locate, lift, and drop a concrete block removes any lingering doubt about intent. This was a methodical, exhausting execution.
And the logistical horror continues immediately after that. They don't just leave the barn and go into hiding.
No. Daniel, Hawkins, and Bobby drive back to Pataskala. They return to the Sheets property.
They retrieve the body of 14-year-old Jamie Kelly, place her in the vehicle, drive all the way back to the barn in Baltimore, and place Jamie's body next to Abby's.
They essentially created a tomb. And Ryan, this brings us to the week of concealment.
For 7 full days, these teenagers return to their daily routines. They monitor the news and the police search.
They actively lie to investigators who are canvassing the area looking for Abby and Jamie.
But they do not maintain this deception alone. This is where we must focus on the institutional failure of Elsie Sheets.
She is 54 years old. She is informed by her son of what has occurred, and her response is not to dial 911.
No. Her response is to actively facilitate a cover-up.
The domestic details of her complicity are what I find most unsettling about this entire case.
Elsie Sheets takes the blood-soaked clothes of the offenders and washes them in her own home.
She does laundry to destroy the evidence of a double homicide.
And the records specifically highlight that later, she made pizza for the...
The cognitive dissonance required to wash the blood of murdered children out of your son's clothes and then prepare a meal for the killers in your kitchen is incomprehensible.
It is the absolute normalization of extreme violence within a family structure. Elsie Sheets provided a physical and psychological safe harbor for murderers.
And her involvement didn't stop at domestic chores. The climax of this cover-up happens approximately a week after the murders.
Elsie Sheets actively purchases gasoline. She then drives Bobby and Sonia back to the barn near Baltimore.
Once they arrive, they use that gasoline to set the barn on fire.
The goal is total destruction of the evidence. A complete incineration of Abby and Jamie's remains before the authorities can find them.
The brutality of these actions, from the initial shots to the stabbing, the concrete block, the transportation of bodies, and finally the arson orchestrated by a parent, begs a massive question.
Why? What could possibly drive this specific group to orchestrate such a prolonged, multi-layered slaughter?
To understand the underlying mechanisms of this crime, we are forced to look past the surface narratives that the killers eventually tried to sell to the police.
Right. We need to examine the source-grounded insights.
According to the official statements and court records, the initial motive floated by Robert Louis Daniel was tied to gang activity. When questioned, Daniel claimed he was attempting to advance his status within a gang, and he stated he believed committing a homicide was a requirement for that advancement.
Tessa, this is where we have to heavily push back on Daniel's narrative.
Absolutely.
This idea of a gang initiation is a complete myth in this context. The official investigations explicitly confirm that this was a personal delusion held by Daniel.
There was no verified criminal organization pulling the strings here.
Hiding behind the excuse of a gang initiation was a cowardly attempt by Daniel to diffuse his personal responsibility into a fictional collective.
It is a way of saying, the gang made me do it, I had no choice, when in reality the motives were far more mundane and toxic.
Investigators and the court completely dismantled that gang theory. No verified gang existed, and none of the participants were documented members of one.
The real motives, as outlined in the official findings, were deeply interpersonal. We are looking at a fatal convergence of chaotic elements.
First, you have Daniel's personal delusion and his desperate desire for violent status.
Right. Second, you have extreme, unhinged jealousy. The records make it clear that Sonia Hawkins harbored open, aggressive hostility toward Abbey.
This toxic jealousy provided the fuel for the escalation.
And third, you have peer pressure and emotional volatility. This unstructured group reinforced each other's worst impulses.
And finally, you have the profound betrayal by Bobby and the adult complicity of Elsie Sheets normalizing the entire environment.
Furthermore, this wasn't just a spontaneous eruption of violence that happened out of nowhere.
No, witnesses from Watkins Memorial High School testified that members of the Sheets family and Sonia Hawkins had openly threatened Abbey prior to the murders.
This establishes a clear pattern of premeditation rooted in personal conflict long before anyone walked to a graveyard.
Moving to the forensic and pathological findings, the condition of the bodies when they were discovered on October 2nd presented significant challenges for the medical examiners.
The remains were heavily charred and partially incinerated due to the arson orchestrated by Elsie Sheets.
Right, and when you're dealing with fire forensics, the destruction of soft tissue severely complicates both the identification process and the trauma analysis.
But despite the extreme damage from the fire, the forensic analysis yielded definitive clinical findings. The fire did not erase the truth.
Tessa, explain how the pathologists were able to confirm the exact sequence of violence through the damage.
The fire destroys a lot, but it does not destroy bone, and it does not destroy ballistics in the same way. The findings were very clear.
Okay.
For 14-year-old Jamie Kelly, the cause of death was ballistic trauma. The physical evidence remained consistent with an immediate fatality from the gunshot wound to the head she sustained at the Sheets property.
And for Abbey?
For 15-year-old Abbey Worrell, the pathology confirmed the agonizing sequence of events we discussed. The medical examiners documented injuries from multiple weapons.
They found the evidence of the non-fatal gunshot wounds.
Yes, they identified the marks on the bone consistent with the incised wounds from stabbing, and they documented the catastrophic blunt force trauma to the skull caused by the concrete block.
The forensic timeline also locked the entire narrative into place. The scientific analysis determined that the girls had been dead for approximately 4 to 7 days before their discovery on October 2nd.
This perfectly corroborated the witness accounts of the week-long concealment and aligned exactly with the timing of the arson.
The science backed up the horrific timeline of events that the teenagers tried to burn away.
The investigation that followed the discovery was led by Fairfield County Sheriff Gary Demistry.
And the critical break in the case didn't come from a complex forensic manhunt, but from a fracture within the offender's own circle.
Right. The breakthrough occurred when Sonia Hawkins' mother contacted the police to report stolen firearms.
That seemingly administrative report provided the thread that investigators pulled to unravel the entire cover-up.
Once the arrests were made, the charges filed were extensive, reflecting the multi-layered nature of the crime.
Aggravated murder, complicity to aggravated murder, arson, tampering with evidence, gross abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice.
One of the most chilling details from the aftermath of the arrests is a statement Elsie Sheets made to reporters.
While actively denying direct involvement in the actual physical killings, she stood before the press and simply said, "We was there."
That statement perfectly encapsulates the legal principle that ultimately sent her to prison. Let's look at the legal adjudication.
Robert Louis Daniel, the primary shooter, received an aggregate sentence of approximately 35 years to life, following an appellate reduction.
The records indicate he remains incarcerated with parole eligibility in 2029.
Sonia Hawkins was convicted of complicity to aggravated murder and related felonies for her role in the stabbing and the concealment.
But I want to focus deeply on Bobby and Elsie Sheets because their convictions hinge on a very specific area of Ohio law.
They were convicted under the principle of complicity. I think a lot of people assume that if you don't pull the trigger, you can only be charged as an accessory after the fact.
Right.
Tessa, explain how the law views their actions, particularly how active participation in concealment elevates culpability to actual murder.
It is a vital legal distinction, Ryan. Under Ohio complicity law, you do not have to pull the trigger to be convicted of murder.
Think of it like being the architect of a bank robbery. You might not walk into the bank with the weapon, but if you planned the route, provided the car, and hid the money, You are responsible for the robbery.
In this case, if you actively participate in the concealment of a crime while a victim is still alive, which Bobby did, by physically helping transport a critically injured Abby in the trunk of his car, you are complicit in her eventual death.
So the act of moving her, knowing she needed medical help, and deliberately denying it to hide the crime makes him a murderer in the eyes of the law.
Exactly. Furthermore, if you actively aid the offenders while the crime is ongoing, or immediately after, providing logistical support to destroy evidence, the law elevates your culpability.
Elsie Sheets didn't just stay quiet. She bought the gasoline.
She drove them to the barn. She facilitated the arson.
By actively providing the means to destroy the evidence and protect the killers, she is no longer just an accessory after the fact.
Her active facilitation makes her legally responsible for the murder itself.
The fallout from these murders also extended into the civil courts, which shows how wide the blast radius of this crime really was.
The official records reference a civil case, Worrell versus Daniel.
This case became a landmark regarding insurance liability. It established firm legal limits on whether a homeowner's insurance policy can be held liable for intentional, malicious criminal acts committed by the insured.
It essentially ruled that you cannot use an insurance policy as a financial shield for a premeditated murder.
It was a secondary but highly legally significant ripple effect of the violence that occurred that week.
As we look at all of this evidence, the timeline, the forensic data, and the court records, we are left to synthesize a tragedy that profoundly altered the region.
The Pataskala adolescent homicides were a multi-motive convergence. It wasn't one simple thing that went wrong.
It was a toxic, volatile mixture of teenage jealousy, absolute betrayal by someone who was supposed to be trusted, and an extreme, almost unfathomable level of adult complicity.
The community impact was devastating. Think about the shock that rippled through Pataskala, Baltimore, and the surrounding areas in Licking and Fairfield counties.
It is one thing for a town to realize that its own youth are capable of such sudden, brutal violence. That is a hard enough reality to process.
But the horror was magnified exponentially when the community realized that an adult parent, a 54-year-old mother, knew exactly what had happened and did not stop it.
She didn't call for help. She actively facilitated the slaughter and the burning of high school girls.
It shatters the fundamental assumption that adults will act as the guardrails of society.
It leaves us with a deeply unsettling question regarding justice and the environment in which violence ferments.
The legal system can hand down a sentence of 35 years to life. It can convict a mother of complicity and send her to prison.
But how does any system adequately punish the sheer normalization of violence within a home?
When a mother stands at her washing machine, scrubbing the blood of teenagers out of clothing, and then turns to the oven to bake a pizza for the perpetrators, while two girls lay dead in a cold barn miles away, I struggle to understand that specific void of human empathy. We want to hear from you. If you have insights, questions, or theories, reach out. Your voice helps keep these stories alive.
And if you want to hear more episodes of The Dark Dive, consider following and subscribing. It helps us continue bringing these stories to light.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Dark Dive.